We're going to continue looking at inventory, but inventory changes over time because your demand is going to change. The calendar, our 12-month calendar, if you're distributing products through a retail channel, realistically, 40% of all retail sales end up occurring in 3 months, October, November, December. That will totally change the demand. If you're in the auto industry, you have an auto industry that likes to introduce cars. The cars tend to be introduced in the fall months, but they really rev up, so to speak, pun intended, okay, in January, February, as the new year launches and everybody's all excited. And then they have a liquidation happening in June, July, August as they prepare for the next year. So you have a cycle that's every industry will have a different cycle. You almost have to work in an industry for 12 months just to get the feel of the cycle. And then to be a regular pro at it, you need about 10,000 hours. Typically, that's 2,080 hours of work time a year. So you're looking at really about 6 to 10,000 hours makes you a pro in the industry. So that being said, demand will change over time. Similar trade-offs exist, but in this case, order quantities change over time as well. If you're looking on the 3J months, January, June, and July, almost all retails, you will have a brief slump over there. In January, in the retail world, you have a diminished amount of supply because people went nuts over the holiday season and spent a massive amount of money. Now they're getting the credit card bills in January. June and July, half the world is on vacation. So you have that going on. So you have that. So you have to pay attention to all the different aspects of what that means if you're selling a product that's going to be on retail shelving. If you're going business to business, you'll also have your own business cycle that'll be unique to your industry that you're supplying to. And then if you're supplying a product to multiple different types of industries, you'll have to get the rhythm to know how demand changes over time. This model relaxes restriction in the economic lot sizes because orders change over time. They're going to reflect demand. So we're looking at this different thing about known demand changing over time. In any period, it never makes sense to both carry inventory from the previous period and often order. Sometimes you carry things over and don't order. Sometimes it's a smart move, and sometimes it's going to depend on your industry. It's a really bad move. If you're in the fashion industry and you're dealing with fast fashion, all of a sudden you're dealing with people who are having either cheap labor or even prison labor making clothing. And so you're dealing with fast fashion, and all of a sudden they're cranking fashion out and they're selling it. And after 3 months, they shift to something else and they're selling it at ridiculously cheap prices. That's why they call it fast fashion, because of low pricing and fast changeover. So sometimes if you just sit down and ramp up production over here, all of a sudden the consumer is off to the next cool thing and you ain't it. So that's a big deal. So pay attention on the known demand changing over time, because if you're in the industry where demand changes, especially different looks, different appearances, that's a big issue. Also, technology can eat into your order as well. If you're doing something and it's technology that is being changed rapidly, especially now with the addition of artificial intelligence, that you may have an issue because in fact you have old stuff. Can your old stuff handle the new stuff, or do you need to come out with a different type of product on a regular basis? So when an order is placed, the order must be for the sum of the future demands that are going to be on your product. So that being said, here's 3 rules you have to know. When somebody makes a forecast, make the assumption it's always wrong. Listen, if the forecast is accurate, in the way I use for strategic planning, I focus on a window of 3 years plus. You only, for planning purposes, you have to be 80% accurate in 3 years. When it comes down to forecasting for marketing, if you're 80% right for 1 year from now, life is good. So it depends where you're at in the process. The longer the forecast horizon, the worse the forecast, the more uncertainty is in the market because the market can fluctuate. It could be your industry, but it could be so many things. It could be a matter of all of a sudden just selling products to one country and they have a military revolution in there and they nationalize all the industries. And all of a sudden you lose your entire base because the dictator decided to sell to his own friend, his personal friend for many, many years. Those things actually happen. Maybe there's a giant storm that levels a big part of the country and their resources shift from consumer goods to all of a sudden emergency provisions. You'll have a lot of different things. Things over time will worsen and it damages the overall forecast that you may have. You may spend hours doing it, but the reality is that that forecast will always be wrong on big picture, especially the longer the window. Aggregate forecasts are more accurate. By aggregate, you're gathering different forecasts and different ways of doing them. That really improves the overall forecast. It's difficult to match supply and demand, but that's what makes business interesting. And also, those that do adapt to it, they make more money. It's again longer distance, and it's difficult to predict demand for individual SKUs. And by SKUs, it really is the individual item. We put a label on them. We call the SKU, SKU, in the process. So that being said, look on the short life cycle of a product. Hence, the firm you only have one ordering opportunity sometimes, or you may have multiple depending upon the life cycle of that item. Before the demand occurs, you need to decide how much stock you need to have in order to meet demand. Pay attention, and that's why you pay attention to what is going to be happening in the next year. A lot of times, retail, we use the word of 1 year as to what it's going to be like for actually your forecasting, but you also need to constantly have an updated for a 2, 3, then even a 10-year forecast in the industry. But just realize that that 10-year forecast, the probability of you actually forecasting what's going to be 10 years out in 10 years is slim to zero somewhere in the process of it being accurate. So pay attention to the methodology. Single period models are easier because of the fact you're going to focus in on that time period and the average profit. You want to order the quantity that it maximizes the expected total profit, not necessarily what is actually on the average demand. So pay attention to that. Pay attention to the marginal profit and the marginal cost of ordering just one additional unit, and figure that out. And then have 100, and then have 1,000, and then a 10,000 units. It depends what the product is and what are the average order size in the process. If the cost is for not selling a unit is larger than profit from selling one additional unit, what is the optimal quantity in general for less than average demand? If you have average demand over here and that isn't met and you have a carrying cost of that item, how much is the carrying cost? Or if you don't have enough, how much is it? Typically, a lot of times we're looking for a 97% service rate in the industry. What happens if you have 98% and you miss 1% and you lose customers because they want it now and you don't have it, so they go to another vendor? A lot of times they will stay with that new vendor unless you have some extraordinary thing that separates you from the quality of the other vendor, and they're taking that as a, oh, well, I guess I'll have to go with this one. It's not quite as good. Hopefully you have that type of a product, but you may lose that customer. Can you stand to lose 3% customers every single order period? You got to pay attention to that. So we'll talk about different ways to service them later on, and that's always a big deal. The optimal order quantities is not necessarily equal to forecast or average of the demand. So it just depends where it's coming from. As the order quantity increases, the average profitability typically increases until you really have the production quantity, it reaches a value. So as the more you sell, the probability of you getting more profit is higher. We increase the quantity, and the risk increases because of the fact that you may not meet all the demand. So forecasting that demand is a big deal. If you're going to go out and do forecasting, I always recommend what you expect, having a model where the world is fabulous and you sell a massive amount more, and also if you have a world where it doesn't work well. I typically would work with 3 forecasting models in any budgetary model. I think it's always the best thing to have what you expect, what the future may hold, and also what would happen if the future bombs and you have a lot of problems with it. So I do all 3. But that being said, this class, we're going to focus in on your expectations. Initial inventory, consider a situation in which a firm already has some inventory in hand, no additional orders placed or produced, and the on-hand inventory can be used to meet some demand. When initial inventory, what you already have in stock, is available, the trade-off between having that limited amount of inventory by avoid paying the fixed cost versus paying the fixed cost, you're going to have a higher inventory level. So pay attention to that. If you get rid of all your inventory and have to build again. You're going to have a fixed cost that you need to have every single time you produce that again. Your startup costs, your actual labor involved with making the product and then putting it on the shelf and waiting or selling. Hopefully, you're selling the entire product line that you're making. So pay attention to that when we talk about the S. Okay, whenever the inventory level is reviewed, through a physical or data inventory. Okay, if it's below a certain value, let's say S, we order or produce the inventory to the level that we want. So if it's down here, okay, whenever you want to start up your whole aspect, your production again, you want to rise it to the level that you want. So we call this a min-max policy. Sell, 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 click. Oh, I got this. I got 4 left. Okay, I'm going through 4 every 2 weeks. So I got to do this. Okay, so I have a really a 7-day process to get set up and actually manufacture. So you get it back and now you're at the maximum S. And hopefully you're paying attention to what your big S should be. Maybe you need to pay attention to it. Maybe you adjust that because of the fact that you have a J month coming, let's say June or July. Maybe your big S for June and July is smaller than it is for October, November, December because people are gearing up for that holiday season. You have to pay attention to your schedule when it comes down to your optimal inventory levels. Sometimes you're going to adjust that optimal inventory level by the month. Also, sometimes you may adjust it by an advertising campaign that's going on. That's why the whole thing is variable, and that's why they're going to hire you because you're really smart because you know this stuff. So demand changing over time, know the rules of forecasting. There's 3 of them. Know about the concept of min max. Here's the minimum you want to have for your safety stock. If you have down to the whatever this number may be down here, then you have it over here. Once upon a time, my very first experience of this, it was a long time ago. I had to help an auto parts store sit down there and choose the minimum amount. We did something simple. It was the absolute no technology, no brain. We put 4x6 cards on the parts and everything in the shelf. We calculated for each one of 137 parts. I remember the number. And on the 137 parts that were main sellers, we made up a 3x5 card. It says order, and we put the number they would order and the SKU number on it, and boom. So they would get down to part 1 or 2, whatever they had left in inventory. They get the cards. At the end of the week, they put all the cards together. Click, click, click. They'd order everything else, put the cards back in stock, and when everything came in, that's min max. That is prehistoric min max. Now we have computers that do all this, except for the fact that you do it just once a week nowadays. You might have an empty shelf, and an empty shelf means you can't sell anything because that shelf is empty, and the consumer sees the empty shelf and doesn't even know what belongs on that shelf. Product life cycle is a big thing. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. But for right now, the product life cycle is a big deal as to how long that product can sit and live on your shelf without any potential difficulties. Demand changes over time. Know that and figure out and put that into your calculations when you're calculating the overall min max for your product. Take care.